In the winter of 1658, a single document would shatter the dreams of a once mighty empire and redraw the map of northern Europe forever. The Treaty of Roskilde, signed on the 26th of February in a Danish cathedral, would strip Denmark of large swathes of its heartlands in one of the most devastating defeats in Scandinavian history. But this wasn't just about land or power. This was about the violent death of a vision that had dominated the Baltic for centuries, the dream of a unified Nordic empire under Danish rule. What happened in that cold cathedral would echo through the halls of European politics for generations. But the story of how Sweden's young warrior king brought Denmark to its knees is far more shocking than you might imagine. To understand the catastrophe of Roskilde, we must first journey back to the golden age of Danish power, when Copenhagen's influence stretched from the Arctic Circle to the German states. For over 2 centuries, Denmark had been the dominant force in the Baltic Sea, controlling the vital Sound, the narrow waterway connecting the Baltic to the North Sea, and collecting tolls from every merchant vessel that dared to pass. The Danish crown ruled not just Denmark itself, but Norway, the southern tip of Sweden, and scattered territories across northern Germany. King Christian IV had transformed Copenhagen into one of Europe's most magnificent capitals, its spires reaching toward heaven as a testament to Danish supremacy. But by 1657, this empire was crumbling from within, hollowed out by decades of costly wars and religious conflicts that had drained the royal treasury. The 30 Years' War had been particularly devastating, forcing Denmark to mortgage its future to foreign creditors, while its armies suffered humiliating defeats across German battlefields. Danish nobles whispered in darkened corridors about the kingdom's mounting debts, while merchants complained that Swedish competition was slowly strangling their trade routes. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the fate of Scandinavia itself. The architect of Denmark's downfall was a man who seemed born for war, Charles X Gustav of Sweden, a king whose very name would become synonymous with military genius and ruthless ambition. When he ascended to the Swedish throne in 1654, Charles inherited a kingdom that had been transformed by his predecessor into a formidable military machine. But he also inherited something far more dangerous, an obsession with expanding Swedish power at Denmark's expense. The young king's court buzzed with whispers of ancient grudges and territorial claims that stretched back centuries. Sweden's nobles remembered when Danish kings had ruled over Swedish lands, and they hungered for revenge. Charles himself had been raised on stories of Swedish humiliation, of how Danish forces had once occupied Stockholm and forced Swedish royalty to bend the knee. These weren't just political grievances, they were personal wounds that had festered for generations. The Swedish military had been revolutionized under Gustavus Adolphus, creating a professional army that combined innovative tactics with unprecedented discipline. But Charles brought something new to this war machine, a calculating intelligence that could identify his enemies' weaknesses with surgical precision. He spent months studying Danish military reports, analyzing fortress designs, and mapping supply lines with the dedication of a scholar. But Charles wasn't content with mere border adjustments. He envisioned nothing less than the complete destruction of Danish hegemony in the Baltic. As 1657 dawned, Swedish armies were already mobilizing along the Danish border, but Christian IV's successor, Frederick III, remained blissfully unaware of the storm that was about to engulf his kingdom. The first blow came not from the north, but from an unexpected alliance that would prove Denmark's undoing. Charles Gustav had secretly negotiated with Transylvania's prince, George II Rákóczi, to launch a coordinated attack on Poland, Denmark's crucial ally in the complex web of Baltic politics. When Polish forces were tied down fighting in the east, Denmark would be isolated, cut off from the military support that had protected it for decades. The Swedish king's diplomatic genius extended far beyond simple military alliances. He had spent years cultivating relationships with French ministers, promising them Swedish support against Habsburg power in exchange for gold and political backing. French subsidies flowed into Swedish coffers, funding the military preparations that would soon devastate Denmark. But the Swedish king's masterstroke wasn't just diplomatic, it was meteorological. The winter of 1657-58 was one of the harshest on record, with temperatures so brutal that the Baltic Sea itself began to freeze solid. The Little Belt, a strait between the island of Funen and the Jutland Peninsula, was the location for their daring mission. As Danish sentries watched from their coastal fortresses, they witnessed something that defied belief. Swedish armies marching across the frozen straits, their boots crunching on ice, thick enough to support cavalry and artillery. The natural moat that had protected Denmark for centuries had become a highway for its enemies. Danish military engineers had never planned for such a scenario. Their fortifications faced inland, designed to repel land-based invasions, not armies emerging from the frozen sea like ghostly apparitions. Frederick III's advisors scrambled to comprehend this impossible situation, but by then, Swedish forces were already landing on Danish shores. What followed was a military campaign so swift and devastating that European observers struggled to believe the reports reaching their capitals. Charles Gustav's forces swept through Jutland like a winter storm, crushing Danish resistance with a combination of superior tactics and sheer audacity. Decades of prosperity had left Danish defences woefully ill-prepared. Many fortifications were outdated, designed for earlier types of warfare, and proved unable to withstand the lethal concentrated artillery fire of the Swedes. The Danish army, once a respected and feared force in Northern Europe, had become a shadow of itself. Years of relative peace meant that both officers and rank and file lacked the training and discipline of their Swedish counterparts. Sweden's army, reorganized since the reign of Gustavus Adolphus, blitzed the Danes with methods that stressed coordination between infantry, cavalry, and artillery. That artillery was fluid, mobile, deadly, and could be repositioned quickly to break down defensive positions. The Danish nobility provided feeble leadership. Their failure to mobilize resources for the war was ruinous, and the lack of organized resistance at the regional level deadly. This dereliction of duty meant many towns offered little or no defense before Swedish occupation. The speed of the campaign caused chaos. Orders sometimes reached garrisons after the positions concerned had already fallen. Supply routes broke down under pressure, leaving Danish forces unable to regroup. Cities fell one by one with little resistance: Middelfart, Assens, Svendborg. At Hinsgård Castle, 500 German mercenaries surrendered and joined the Swedish ranks. The Danes were in disarray. By January 1658, Charles's armies were approaching Copenhagen itself, and Frederick III faced a choice that would define his reign: surrender or watch his capital burn. But even as the Danish king contemplated capitulation, Charles was preparing his most audacious move yet. The march across the frozen Little Belt was one of the most daring military maneuvers in European history, a feat so extraordinary that many contemporaries dismissed early reports as propaganda. But Charles understood that conventional warfare alone wouldn't achieve his ultimate goal, the complete subjugation of Denmark. He needed to strike at the very heart of Danish power, the island of Zealand, where Copenhagen sat like a jewel in the crown of Danish civilization. This crossing, the strait between Funen and Zealand, the Great Belt, was significantly longer and more perilous than the Little Belt. The Swedish king's scouts had confirmed that the ice was thick enough to support his army, but the risks were enormous. Swedish military engineers had spent weeks testing the ice thickness, drilling holes and measuring depths, while Danish observers watched helplessly from the distant shore. If the ice broke, thousands of Sweden's finest soldiers would plunge to their deaths in the freezing waters below. Charles's own generals pleaded with him to reconsider, warning that such a gamble could destroy Sweden's military power in a single catastrophic moment. But Charles had calculated the risks with mathematical precision. The ice was thick enough, the weather was holding, and Danish forces were too demoralized to mount effective resistance even if they reached Zealand. The Swedish king's confidence wasn't just military, it was almost mystical, as if he believed destiny itself was guiding his path across the frozen sea. Yet, on the night of the 5th of February, 1658, the Swedish army began its impossible journey across the frozen sea, their torches flickering like stars against the black ice as they advanced toward Denmark's last stronghold. The question became, who would collapse first, the Danish resistance or the Swedish king's consuming ambition? The negotiations that led to the Treaty of Roskilde were, unlike anything in European diplomatic history, a deadly game of chess played between two monarchs who each held the other's fate in their hands. Frederick arrived at the cathedral city of Roskilde, knowing that he was bargaining with a man consumed by unbridled ambition, but the Swedish king's desperate urgency made him more dangerous, not less. Charles's awareness of his military advantage had stripped away any pretense of diplomatic courtesy. He wanted everything, and he wanted it immediately. He demanded concessions that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. the entire provinces of Scania, Halland, and Blekinge, effectively the southern third of modern Sweden, along with the strategic island of Bornholm and key territories in Norway. These weren't just territorial adjustments, they were the dismantling of Danish power itself. Scania contained some of Denmark's most fertile agricultural land, while Halland controlled crucial trade routes between Denmark and the continent. The Danish negotiators fought desperately to preserve something of their kingdom's integrity. They understood better than anyone what these territorial losses would mean for Danish commerce and military security. Their problem was that they had been dealt a losing hand. Militarily speaking, the Danes were a busted flush, faced with the reality that they had no leverage and that they sat opposite a particularly intransigent opponent. Their role in the negotiations was essentially to cede one concession after another. The Swedish king's overwhelming ambition had made him impatient. He wanted everything, and he wanted it now, while his armies still held the advantage. On the 26th of February, 1658, as snow swirled around the ancient stones of Roskilde Cathedral, the treaty was signed in a ceremony that marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. The document that emerged from those negotiations didn't just redraw borders, it fundamentally altered the balance of power in Northern Europe. Denmark lost huge chunks of its territory and its population in a single stroke of the pen. The proud kingdom that had dominated the Baltic for centuries was reduced to a rump state, its dreams of Nordic empire shattered forever. The human cost was staggering. Families were separated by new borders, Danish nobles lost ancestral estates that had been in their families for generations, and thousands of Danish soldiers found themselves suddenly subjects of the Swedish crown. The economic consequences were equally devastating. Swedish control of former Danish provinces created a stranglehold on Danish trade routes, forcing Copenhagen to negotiate from a position of permanent weakness. With Swedes now exempt from the sound tolls, Danish merchants who once dominated Baltic commerce found themselves at a huge disadvantage. But perhaps the most tragic irony of all was that Charles Gustav's triumph would prove short-lived. The Swedish king died just 2 years later in 1660, his body finally succumbing to pneumonia after years of relentless campaigning had weakened his constitution. His death came while planning yet another campaign against Denmark, suggesting that even his greatest triumph couldn't satisfy his boundless ambitions. The territories he had fought so hard to win would remain Swedish for centuries, but the man who conquered them never saw their full integration into his realm. His son, Charles XI, inherited a vastly expanded kingdom, but also the burden of defending conquests that had been won through his father's consuming drive for glory. The Treaty of Roskilde had indeed torn Scandinavia apart, creating wounds that would take generations to heal and establishing a new order in Northern Europe that would persist until the rise of Russia as a Baltic power. The cathedral where it was signed still stands today, its walls having witnessed one of the most dramatic transfers of power in European history. Visitors walking through its ancient halls rarely realize they're standing in the place where the map of Scandinavia was redrawn forever, where an ambitious king's relentless pursuit of glory reshaped the destiny of millions. Modern Denmark bears little resemblance to the empire that once stretched from the Arctic to the Baltic, its current borders largely determined by that winter day in 1658. The Treaty of Roskilde reminds us that history's greatest turning points often happen not on battlefields, but in quiet rooms where determined men sign documents that echo through the centuries. And sometimes, the greatest victories are won by those whose ambitions ultimately consume them.